Charlie, I'm going to turn it over to you. You just let me know when you want me to advance.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Tanya. Good morning, everybody. Excited to be here for our first of 4 installments for our community of practice around school level planning essentials. Today is all about sifting through the needs assessment. Of course, anything that I do, I have to somehow connect it to like food. Cooking, anything like that. So we're sifting through the needs assessment today. We just want to share with you our school improvement team internally at IU12. My name's Charlie Travato, Supervisor of Professional Learning Services. We also have Tanya Moret, who's our Training and Consultation Supervisor. And Kate Fritz is also helping us with some school planning this spring as well. And she is our LIEP Supervisor.
These agreements, we put them here not necessarily because we feel like we need to establish this agreements with you all, but these are some agreements that we have found have been really helpful when working with some of your leadership teams or when you're working on data and you're getting into some of the hard questions. Take an inquiry stance. You're going to hear a lot about questions today and make sure everything that we're talking about is grounded in evidence. We have a tendency sometimes to hear people say things like, yeah, that's happening here. And we want to be able to do the, to ground everything in evidence so that we can really determine whether or not things are present within a system. You've seen all of the others, right, that have been here before. Those are ones that if you've attended any of our sessions, we just ask you to speak your truth, stick to the protocol. But Charlie and I promise to try and start and end on time, and you have our full attention while we're here. So even though sometimes it looks like we're distracted, it's probably because Charlie's telling me, hey, Tanya, it's your turn to talk.
Awesome. So we have a couple of outcomes for everybody today as we work through the needs assessment. The first thing we're going to do is consider how we collect and organize multiple data sources to support the development of a through line process. And a lot of the work that Tanya's done, especially with our CSI schools, is to help streamline this whole school improvement planning process, soup to nuts, through something called a through line. So she'll take us through no pun intended, the through line this morning, and we will be referencing that through line throughout the 4 installments of this community of practice. We will also talk about turning essential practices into questions. So we have an example of one of our essential practices that we are going to use throughout all 4 of our community of practice installments as an example to help support the work that you are doing, especially when we consider the student groups that you were identified for, whether ATSI or TSI. And then, of course, that last one is all about beginning a through line. So Tanya, feel free to go to the next slide. And I will let her talk a little bit about some of the components of the through line and what we're really going to be supporting through today's specific installment.
So I was first introduced to the through line concept through the DataWise process, and really it's a way of structuring this whole process that makes sense and make sure we're always heading in the same direction. So obviously down here in the bottom right-hand corner, this is our ultimate goal, is to achieve whatever goal we've set out for ourselves. But to get to that point, there's a lot of layers that we kind of have to sift through. And so what I've done is kind of just started with the very first step, which is prioritize a challenge that will be the focus for our plan and takes you all the way to the goal achievement. Now, this is one way to represent a through line, but we've also created a worksheet that is in a forced copy. So when you get it, you'll be able to make a copy of your own. I'm just going to show you what it looks like here. It's really a guide sheet. So you can see all of the areas of the through line are down here along the left-hand side. So the first step, as I mentioned earlier, was prioritize your challenge or your focus area. Here is where the product will go. So you'll see, what is it you're going to create and who should probably create it, especially as a TSI or an ATSI school, you may not have the luxury of time. And so you need to do some of this ahead of time. So that first part, that leadership team recommendation, will go here, and we're going to show you how to use the essential practice as one of your possible products. And what gets you here? So this is the part that is really helpful, because when you're making this decision, this is who's making the decision and what it is. And these are the things that are in your system that you want to use. And so it's really designed to help you know which object am I pulling in at which phase of the process, because otherwise it can get overwhelming with all the different steps and all the different artifacts that you'll be using. We are going to use this as our guide, so I'm not going to go through it now, but I want you to know it's here and it's a reference tool for you to go back to. Today, we are going to get through the first two steps in the process.
Thanks so much, Tanya. So for moving forward, we're going to be taking a look primarily at our essential practices, which is a huge component of our needs assessment. For those that are not familiar, there are 18 essential practices in the state of Pennsylvania for schools going through continuous improvement efforts. And that, of course, can include school level improvement planning. Those 18 essential practices have been bucketed into 4 different condition areas. So if we almost think of them like through the curriculum lens, like our reporting categories and assessment anchors, our conditions are 4 buckets or quote unquote reporting categories that all of our essential practices are nested in underneath. Similar to educator effectiveness with Danielson and the 4 domains and the 22 components. So the 4 specific bucket areas that we have that we look at for operational school improvement is focus on continuous improvement of instruction, empowering leadership, providing student-centered supports, and fostering quality professional learning. So what we thought would be interesting in terms of an example for this group over the next 4 meetings that we have is to really hone in on an example for you all that's tangible and something that's easy to apply within your own system. So what we did, since we all were identified for a specific subgroup or subgroups of students, is we started to think about, well, in the essential practices, what is it that might be a specific area of need or an area of concern or a growth area for our specific buildings? Now, you are welcome to continue to follow Essential Practice 4 if that ends up being your specific area that you're prioritizing within your plan. It might also not be, which is totally cool as well. But for this example, we're going to highlight specifically Essential Practice 4 because of the implications of the identification and addressing of individual student learning needs as it relates to some of the subgroups that we might have been identified for. So you can see on the screen what Essential Practice 4 is. And from the actual reference guide for the 18 essential practices, it shares what is the actual essential practice. What are the 4 specific ratings that we as a team could be rating this particular school around? So is the essential practice not yet evident in our system, emerging, operational, or exemplary? Of course, at the end of all of this, we really want to get to that place where we are operational in our school improvement efforts. That's why you're seeing that little asterisk next to operational. And when we think about our look-fors for operational school improvement, there are multiple different layers of look-fors that we can consider to help us make the determination, are we at the operational stage? Are we exceeding the operational stage? Or are we not at the operational stage yet? There's also some pieces in the bottom right-hand corner of this particular essential practice in the reference guide around guiding questions to help us really focus and structure our efforts around this particular practice, as well as sources of evidence that are available to us or might be available to us to help us make a determination on a specific rating at the top of the screen. So what we have for you are within the Google Drive structure for everyone, we have a specific needs assessment folder in our overall toolkit, our school improvement toolkit, and everything is bucketed under the needs assessment folder around those 4 different condition areas that I mentioned before. And under each one of those condition areas are the specific essential practices that live in each one of those condition areas. In each essential practice, so for example, condition 1 has 5 different essential practices that are applicable to that particular condition of focusing on continuous improvement of instruction. And essential practice 4 is nested in under that particular condition. Within that folder, we see a document around potential sources of evidence for us to consider as we are trying to make a determination around where are we as a system in terms of our overall rating, not yet evident, emerging, operational, or exemplary. So we wanted to share a little bit about some of the folder structure related to our school improvement toolkit.
So how we organize may not be how you organize, but what we have found in doing this is that really when you're going through this process, you want to create some sort of organizational structure within your system that looks like either one of these. I mean, what we're seeing is the pieces of evidence that come out in EPs 1 through 5, right? If we're going to look at the rubric and identify all those pieces of evidence, even though they're assigned or aligned to a specific essential practice, they really all support a rating in that one condition, right? And support an analysis in that one condition. So it really is up to you as you're thinking about how you're going to organize your evidence, because it's going to be a lot easier as Charlie kind of walks you through what it looks like to present this information or organize this information for analysis if everything you need is in one spot. So that this is not necessarily what you have to do. We're just letting you know this is one of those tips that over the years, as Charlie and I've been doing this, we have found really helpful for organizing the information.
So as we consider some of the different pieces of evidence, many of you may or may not be familiar with Victoria Bernhardt's work around continuous improvement efforts within educational systems. So it's really important when we're thinking about the collection and analysis of evidence that we have multiple measures of data that we're taking a look at. And not that we're looking at those different measures in silos, but that we're actually looking and being more purposeful about their intersectionality. So this graphical representation might look super overwhelming, but I got to be honest with you, it's probably one of the best graphics that are out there to show the 4 different types of data and where they intersect with one another. What is it, or maybe multiple areas of data intersect? So not just 2, maybe it's 3 or even 4 of these areas intersect. Really gives us some interesting information around potential questions or what the data could potentially be telling us about our system. So as we work through the different types of data collection that we have, we want to make sure, number one, that we have multiple measures of data that we're looking at, and we're not relying on one source of data as our sole source to make a determination or a decision around our priority areas or needs, but that we're also purposefully looking at those different data sets in tandem with one another and not as 2 mutually exclusive entities. So you can see on the screen, we have 4 different types of data: demographic, perceptions, student learning, and school processes. And what's really interesting about our essential practice that we're giving you as an example, EP4, we're talking about looking at and identifying specific student learning needs. And out of all of these 4 different types of data, the one data type that might specifically stand out to us is student learning data. So data related to maybe 4 different types of assessments that we have within our system, whether it's summative, formative, benchmark, or diagnostic. But as we continue to work through some of the potential sources of evidence that we have nested under Essential Practice 4 in our reference guide, we might not only be seeing student learning data. So I'm going to have Tanya go to the next slide and we can take a look at some of the different types of data that exist. So what Tanya and I did is we extracted all of those sources of evidence from the reference guide that we were talking about earlier on. And we have some different data that we could potentially be pulling that the state is recommending that we take a look at, things like a data analysis protocol or a warehouse or lesson plans. Or if we take a look in that third column, professional learning plans or classroom visits, maybe focus groups or surveys. All of these specific pieces of data, if collected, really help give us that multiple measures that we're looking for in order to make a determination around how are we rating our system in this particular essential practice. And with Tanya taking away some of those blue boxes under the type, what you're probably noticing is it's not really heavy on student learning data. It's more heavy on process and perceptual data as we start to take a look at some of the potential data sources that we either could be collecting or maybe we have collected over time that we could be bringing to the table. So to help you all as we start to think about and consider some of those different types of data, the state has put together a suite of supports in terms of data collection tools to help us perform some type of a crosswalk to make a determination around what is it from these surveys or these focus groups or these walkthroughs that we might be able to engage in that can help us make determinations around prioritizing or not prioritizing certain essential practices. So there are 3 different types of supports that exist. One of them is specifically for educators within your internal system. Another is around students. And then the last type of support is for parents. And what you can notice here, for students and parents, the surveys that exist are both in English and in Spanish. And it does allow you to disaggregate by identification of grade as well. For educators, there is an internal educator survey that's available, but then there's also an essential practices survey, or we also call it a facilitated self-assessment, that help you all on your leadership team really take a look at where do we feel perceptually our school ranks in terms of those overall ratings, not yet evident, emerging, operational, or exemplary, as they relate to those 18 essential practices. So the link at the top of the slide that Tanya has here is a link to some stakeholder survey and self-assessment links, as well as focus groups. Each one of these are forced copies. So whether or not Tanya or myself or Kate would have set these up for you, or if you're just starting to dig into this for the first time, there are links throughout our survey support that the state shares with us that are forced copies to give you the facilitated self-assessment or give you any of those student or parent surveys or even the educator surveys as well.
This page is actually linked on this IU13 school improvement site. So rather than recreate it, it's, from a formatting perspective, Charlie would have changed this significantly and made it a little more navigable, but we don't want to not give you this link in case the state changes something that's on here. So it's really important that this link is the one that we use.
So we also wanted to share with you a little bit about a data story. So Tanya and I were super blessed and honored to go through a lot of the DataWise coursework, especially through the CSI process. And Tanya's actually a DataWise certified coach. But earlier on in our journey with school improvement, back in like 2018, 2019, we had the privilege of working with the Koru team and Harvard DataWise through this process, and they really emphasized a lot about being able to tell our story through the data that we collect. So I wanted to share with you a couple of pieces here. The first one is obviously our survey support that Tanya had opened before. We also have our stakeholder survey, which is that facilitated self-assessment that we were talking about on the last slide. But the last piece that we have here is an example of what a data story could look like. So if you are putting together and trying to organize all of your data and trying to present it to staff, or if you convene a steering committee, presenting this to a specific steering committee, we wanted to share just a rough shell of what this could look like in terms of the essential practices that are available, being able to look at and display our mission, vision, value statements. And then if we needed to come to consensus on any essential practices, we gave you an example on slides 14 and 15 of what this could potentially look like as an activity and a display of data of your facilitated self-assessment and the questions, those guiding questions that we mentioned before on our reference guide that you could be using to make a determination around how are we going to rate this particular essential practice and where does that additional or multiple sets of data kind of come into play. There's also on slide 17 an opportunity for you to organize all of your essential practices ratings. So you might, as a leadership team, go through all 18 essential practices and say, you know what, it was clear as day for 15 of the 18 that we were not yet evident, emerging, operational, or exemplary in each one of those essential practices. So we do need to do a little work with coming to consensus on maybe 3 of those 18 essential practices. So this is a great place to just kind of house and be able to share your story with staff or with the board through your process this spring as you're working on your improvement plan.
You will also need to take this, literally lift the information that's on this slide and put it into the FRCPP, because there is a section under the set where it says, how do you rate yourself in the conditions of teaching and learning? So what we want to make sure is in this process, as much as we want to help you streamline things, we also don't want you to forget about what are the pieces that are in the portal that you need to complete as well.
We also have some additional process and perceptual data sets for you to consider. 2 of them are focus group protocols. So we have an educator and student focus group protocol that have about anywhere between 5 and 8 questions. We also have a learning walk tool for exploring the classroom that the state has provided, but we also wanted to make sure that you were aware that the IU has also put together a learning walk tool. And some of you may or may not have worked with our team on this particular learning walk tool. So we wanted to also provide that resource as well if you're trying to gather some additional data and information. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tanya, and she's going to talk us through how to turn that essential practice 4, into a question that can be used for more measurable and actionable outcomes.
Thanks, Charlie. So ideally, when this process first rolled out, the goal was to go through each of the 18 practices and do a deep dive in each practice. The reality is you need that if you're not looking at data and you're not looking at your system. With the shortened timeline, right, our first deadline for ATSI schools is June 30th, but the deadline for TSI schools to get their plans in the portal is August 31st. You really want to find ways to harness or leverage what you're already doing or what you already have in your system. So remember that through line, right? The first step is to prioritize the challenge or focus area. And the recommendation has always been no more than 3. So if you're going to prioritize areas in a plan, any more than 3 are going to become unmanageable. And I'll tell you, some of the most successful plans that I've seen have had 1 or 2 focus areas, because for each focus area, you're going to have multiple action steps. So this first part, this prioritized challenged area, we want you to, as a leadership team, ask yourselves, what's going to give us the best bang for our buck? And what gets you here? What helps you make that decision? First and foremost, look at your designation letter. What were the areas that you were identified for in terms of opportunities for growth? That might help focus you in. But in addition to that, what are you currently doing in terms of your initiatives or your professional development plan? Because I'm sure that you didn't make the decisions in those items without considering data and considering what your educators may need. Additionally, the educator effectiveness data. So as you're starting to look at how does the distribution of skills show up, where are our teachers proficient, where might they be needs improvement? Maybe that's one of the areas that you focus in on in terms of building capacity or building skill sets. And then obviously the facilitated self-assessment that Charlie and I just kind of real quickly walked you through in terms of organizing data and looking at it. But we're actually going to take that looking at data piece and dig in just a little, because the next part of this is to create, how do we use what we see in front of us with this essential practice? What we would recommend is the first thing that you do, if you've decided that essential practice 4 is your focus area, is you start to look at, right, all of the different types of data. You make sure that you have a swath of the different data types so that you can build a targeted question, right? That's going to drive your work. This targeted question becomes very helpful because all of that data gets overwhelming really quickly, especially if you have folks joining your team who aren't used to looking at data. So while we recommend that you have a stakeholder committee, some of those members, parents, maybe teachers who aren't used to looking at the data at that level of depth, they're going to start to shut down if they don't understand what it is they're looking at. So what we're inviting you to do is to use the data that you have strategically to tell your story. And begin with a problem. What is it you want to investigate? And even enlist their help in generating questions, because those questions are what will lead you not only to data, but to actionable items. So looking at EP4, what is the evidence we have that we do identify and assess individual learning needs? Now, we can start with a blank slate, and you can do a brainstorm activity with your folks. But the state has helped us a little bit in terms of doing a crosswalk of where, of the items that have been provided to schools, which questions in those items are actually aligned to this particular essential practice. Now I'm going to step out of the slideshow just for a minute to show you that down here in the notes section is a link, and this link is the crosswalk that we're talking about. I just want to share it with you so you kind of understand how it's organized. Down here on the left-hand side, you have all of your essential practices. Here is essential practice 4. You see we have the educator, parent, student survey, and other. And actually, this should say educator collected materials, because down here under the educator column, you'll see F, G, 6, and 7. And what that means is that if you go to the focus group questions 6 and 7 of the educator focus group, those questions and the answers to those questions are directly aligned to essential practice 4. And then down below, these are the survey questions in the educator survey that are directly aligned. So what's that mean? I'm going to go back here and show you. If we go to the educator focus group tool and we look at questions 6 and 7, here's what we see. How are you using assessments to monitor student learning? That question might turn into, are we using assessments to monitor student learning? It might turn into, are the assessments we're using finding the students we need to locate that are struggling? Or how are you using that data for decision making? That question may turn into, are we using that data for decision making? And if we are all students benefits of the decisions we make, or only some students? So I don't want to overwhelm you or kind of get too into the weeds, but what I'm hoping you can see is you can use these tools to help you drill down to try and really think about, what does EP4 even mean? I pulled specifically the information from the student survey. Imagine if you had data from students that told you, how often do students agree with the following statements? My teachers often connect what I'm learning to life outside of the classroom. So we're talking about relevancy. My teachers explain information in a way I understand. Wouldn't you want to know how students feel about that? My teachers make sure I understand lessons before teaching something new, or I learn a lot from feedback on my work. If we are doing a student survey and our students are saying, I don't get feedback on my work, well, this becomes one of our actionable questions. What does feedback look like when students show that they're not understanding concepts? That would be a great potential actionable pathway to walk down to write a plan around. Now, in the document, we've actually included several skipped slides that will allow you to look at other tools. So we just showed you the educator focus group questions and the student survey, but there are student focus groups, educator survey, and then also the classroom walkthrough tool. If you look at that one from the state, practice number 4, identify and address individual student learning needs. Here's all the look fors that could really lead us down the path of an actionable and targeted question. But in the rubric, there's that whole list of data sources. What if I don't have all those data sources? Please no, we are not asking you to create them. You're going to use what you have in your system. And if there's something that's listed in there that you say, oh my gosh, that would be really great to have, maybe that's what you use to measure the implementation and effectiveness of your action plan. So this list is just meant to be suggestive and not comprehensive, not something that is a must-have in order to do this work. This is just to give you ideas, especially because, as Charlie kind of showed you in that original piece with the multiple data sources, when we think about identifying and addressing student learning needs, my brain first goes to student performance data. But really, it may be more about the processes we use than the data we're actually collecting on student learning needs. Let's face it, we already know that the learning needs may not be where we want them to be, because that's why we got the designation in that particular student group. So that's already information we know. Instead, let's go look at the process and see if we can fix the process. The questions that emerge from this data gathering process are the ones that are going to lead you to the next step, which is the root cause analysis. That's what Charlie and I are going to bring to you on April 11th, is once you get all that data collected and you start to look at it and you get those questions, what does a root cause analysis look like? So we're bringing you all the way up to that spot. Just remember though, this question, and I've said it several times, the more specific and actionable the answer will be to the question, the easier it will be to write the action plan steps and to collect data to measure implementation and effectiveness. When you're thinking about the questions, make sure you kind of think at it through different levels. So if I'm looking at it through the district level, I'm probably thinking more about the big ticket items, the initiatives, the professional development plans, the macro pieces of data I have in my system. But as you kind of drill down, look at it at the school level and even the department or grade level to make sure that we're trying to get as close to the actions that will impact student achievement or whatever is our goal, because where the teacher and the student meet is the goal that we want to get to. And I see somebody has a hand raised. Is that me? I must have done that by accident, unless somebody else is raising their hand. We just included for you some questions to think about, right? If we're going back to EP4, and let's say we're focusing on the department or grade level, how are we identifying students who are struggling? And let's not forget that while we may have been designated for a student group, we really should start with, first, how are we identifying students who are struggling in any student group before we hone in on a student group? because, you know, if some of you on this call are definitely walking down the MTSS path, and we want to make sure that tier 1 is really solid. So before we start going in and making changes at the intervention level, do all students have access at that tier 1 level? We made this process very seamless in terms of presentation because we want it to be a reference tool for you after you leave here. So the last step in this process is really where your engagement starts to happen. It's your job now to start the through line and think about what are the essential practices that we want to focus in on. This is a real quick graphic, shows you the 4 buckets. Underneath each bucket are the essential practices. So I leave you with the question, which essential practices do you think will be your focus? Before we can stop the recording now, Charlie.